check that one out.
Okay.
And then,
All right.
yeah,
And
anything
I'm
else that
back.
looks interesting to you?
Well,
Okay.
of course, my camera decided to goof up. All right. So, first of all, thank you for coming back, Carl, especially because I know there was a little bit of hesitancy there with not knowing whether or not I'm being genuine or obtuse. And I do want to actually address some of that as one of our first points of order. We got Matt. Matt's coming at us from Savvy, which is a company that handles, well, that's also where I work. That's a company that handles business lifecycle document and processes. So it does data room stuff. So some of this, I think there were some questions about DAOs and smart contracts that were particularly relevant to you, Matt. And then, of course, we have Ryan, who is the one of the leaders in the Dash incubator for the Dash digital currency. So that's our panel today. And so I wanted to start off with how we left off. Well, first, a quick summary of some things we agreed on, and then where I felt like we left off in terms of some practical use cases of blockchain technology. So quickly summarizing, blockchain is a group of technologies, any in a group of technologies with a consensus mechanism that solves the Byzantine general's problem, which could be and also that stores data long-term in a ledger. So there could be a public blockchain that anybody can participate in. There could be a private blockchain that only some people can participate in. But the general idea of a blockchain is that it's a ledger that builds on itself and that solves the Byzantine's general problem, which if somebody could summarize that real quick, that would be wonderful.
What the Byzantine general's problem is?
Yeah, if I gave an accurate description and then what that problem specifically is.
The only thing I would maybe add is, in terms of your description, is to add that not every blockchain actually includes a ledger. Most of them do, but some blockchains just prove that double spending is not occurring and yet have no ledger, no system-wide, no ledger that stores all the transactions that have ever occurred in the system. There are some blockchains based on a protocol called Mimblewimble that basically just proves that nobody's inflating coins and double spending, but it just relies on interactions between disparate nodes in this distributed network for them to engage in transactions with each other.
Okay, so you totally ruined the definition of blockchain. Thanks for that. Now we're back to confused again, but I'm gonna hold that can of worms for later.
Yeah, most of them fit that description. And the other thing I would add is that some people use the term distributed ledger technologies or technology because not all systems that function like blockchains actually have chains of blocks. So it's possible to represent the same things that are happening in a blockchain using other data structures, such as a directed acyclic graph or other things like that, and achieve equivalent functionality. So for this reason, some people use the term DLT or distributed ledger technology to capture this wide umbrella of technologies that have these properties without trying to get specific about what data structures are used to achieve those properties.
Okay. All right. That opens up a can of worms that I don't want to go into right now. But now I've got more questions in that front.
It's probably more detail than we need to go into, but it's just some minor footnotes on what you just said. That's all I was trying to do.
Okay, cool. So the basic Byzantine generals problem or double spend problem, what is the best way to summarize that?
So I would, as I understand that problem, it's basically that you have various actors that are trying to communicate reliably with one another in an untrusted medium, right? Because you don't know, for example, in this original problem, you have several generals that are occupying different positions in the real world, and they're sending messengers back and forth. and they don't know for sure if their messages are being read in transit or being tampered with in transit. And solving the problem would essentially allow them to have confidence that the messages that are being sent are what was intended to be sent, and that they trust that they're getting, the intended messages from each other. Um, and there are various ways that this problem is solved in a blockchain context specifically, but that's kind of the way the story used to describe the original problem.
Okay, good enough. Anything to add to that, Ryan?
I would say that the general problem that they're trying to solve is one of consensus and trust. So just that's blockchain. If we want to keep using the blockchain term, Carl pointed out, and I will just re-emphasize that the blockchain is just a data storage. It's a data structure.
Okay.
But what's really important in these systems is being able to come to consensus in a system that is basically open access. Everybody can join this. It's not permissioned. Anybody can join the network and act like they are a good, honest part of the network, when in reality they may not be, but they will still be contributed as part of consensus. So if they're bad actors that just want to disrupt, then there has to be some way to come to consensus on that.
Okay.
One other little caveat I would add to Ryan's description is that there are blockchains that are permissioned where only certain actors can participate in them. And there's still blockchains in the sense that between the actors who have permission to be in the blockchain, there is kind of a general consensus, and each of them has an equal seat at the table in terms of being able to see and approve transactions and verify that the transactions are occurring as expected. So no one owns all the data or gatekeeps all the data and the interactions, but they're not permissionless in the sense that they're not a public utility that anybody can join.
Okay. So one of my dangling questions from last time was surrounded around this idea of what are the uses that are not created by a blockchain. Because my whole premise of it's a solution looking for a problem is that so many of the problems that blockchains solve only solve if you have to first have the blockchain in order to have the problem. And you, Carl, had talked about specifically GPS data and weather data, and how there's an application that's a real world practical application for logistics, I think it was, dealing with GPS data and weather data. And so I want to get more detail on how can these systems be useful for things in the real world, and particularly in light of how are they better than something that exists along any given metric, and preferably something that's not just theoretical, but something that actually is in use or being implemented today.
Sure. I guess the first caveat I would say with that desire is that it is important to understand that we are still in the early days of blockchain development. And so some of the more exotic use cases out there are not as mature as the use case that everyone got to first, which started with Bitcoin, which was cryptocurrencies. So the ability to exchange value across borders in a way that each stakeholder could trust that was working correctly. That was the first use case, and that one works pretty well.
Yeah, and with systems like Dash, I'm actually bought in that this is a good idea. Not that it actually is I'm bought in on that from the last session.
Okay. So that use case aside of cryptocurrencies, and then I would almost want to lump in general financial services as like closely related to exchanging value across borders, the way cryptocurrencies allow you to do. If you're going to set aside all those use cases and say what besides those use cases is being done on blockchain and can be done in ways that are better than it can be done elsewhere, is
Well,
that a fair question? As the other thing,
yeah, but we could take a minute to clarify with the financial institution, because again, it seems to me. So let me clarify what I think is a good idea.
okay,
Money only has value because a group of people agree that it has value. It has no value in of itself. A piece of cotton with green print on it and a little holographic stripe has no inherent value other than its art. That maybe I'd say, oh, this is a pretty piece of art. I'd pay $5 for that.
except if it's really easy to get tons of them, then it might be worth less than $5, right?
Sure. But say $100 bill as a piece of art, I'd pay $5 for it.
Okay.
It looks cute, right?
All right.
But
But if I had a suitcase full of them, you'd be like, those are easy to get, right?
yeah, maybe I'd give you a dollar because it seems that, with taxes and fees and everything else, a dollar is about as low as you can go, where somebody ends up getting a quarter out of it at the end of the day. But
Sure.
so, but my point is, money has no value other than that we as a community agree that it has value. And there is some limit in the supply of money that allows us to attribute more value to it. And because if we want to exchange more and there's not enough to exchange, then the value of the money is actually higher by virtue of there's more exchange that we want to do than we have the capacity to do. And so there is some sort of supply and demand in that where money does, if we agree on it as a medium of exchange and there's not enough to go around, then the value would increase. And likewise, planned inflation, if too much money is put into the system on purpose, then the value will of course decrease. So that's money. And in the case of something like Dash, where it doesn't cost a lot of money to transact in Dash, the cost is almost nothing to transact in it. And we, as people who use Dash, believe that it has some value. We agree to trade with one another on the basis of the value that we agree on, not on some value that Dash creates by the virtue of a cryptographic function signing something. So that's the basis on which I'm on board. I agree. I've seen the light. I do not see the Bitcoin light because I don't see it being fundamentally useful as a way to exchange value unless you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. But the Dash use case where it's proof of stake more than it's proof of service, more than it's proof of work, so everybody kind of benefits from the transactions that I'm bought into. Now on the financial services side, go ahead.
It's worth mentioning that you just barely got through saying that you're not so sure something about digital signatures, but it's worth mentioning that digital signatures are actually essential for Dash to function.
Oh yes, right? Yes, but the digital signature cost a few CPU cycles. There's no the value. I'm not paying for in a sense I am, because I'm paying for a group of service nodes that I trust to independently verify the signatures. I don't trust every single one of the nodes, but I trust that in aggregate the nodes are behaving according to the rules that have been set forth.
Yeah.
So in the financial services, what I don't get is it seems that it's just used as another form of stock. And maybe that actually is really useful. Maybe I've been overlooking that because maybe we want companies to be able to operate internationally and not be bound to a specific government. And we want to say anybody in the world can put something in this stock. And I guess those would be the niche coins that, each company has its own coin. So maybe I could be convinced on that because it sounds kind of like Dash, but for stock. But I don't know what else is in financial services or why it would be useful.
So isn't it worth pointing out that Dash is just another coin? And so in as much as all cryptocurrencies have some unit of some denomination, like in this case Dash or ETH or BTC or whatever, in as much as those are all coins and each of them has some kind of value of exchange for actual dollars. They each have a certain value. Isn't that,
My
doesn't that
point.
same argument apply to all of those?
So the reason that I'm a Dash fanboy, and actually equally, maybe I could be a Doge fanboy, other than that Doge is intentionally a joke, and so it's hard to take something seriously that says literally I'm a joke. But Dash can be used for everyday purchases, right? So if you want to pay me something that cost $1, Dash is useful for that. Ethereum's not, Bitcoin's not.
Why not?
Because
He's
the
saying
cost of a
$1
transaction,
specifically.
yes, $1, right? So the transaction cost on Ethereum is what, a minimum of $40.
Oh, I got you. You're just saying that the transaction costs make microtransactions not worth it, basically.
Right, and then we're back to one of the big problems that we have with the credit cards already.
Transactions, just non-mega transactions.
Yeah, I think
you
that
kind of have to have a mega transaction for a $5 or $10 fee to make sense.
So it's also worth pointing out.
But it's a continuum.
It's also worth pointing out that all blockchains, even Dash, have scalability limits. And while the particular limits of Dash versus Bitcoin versus ETH and all the many other hundreds of blockchains out there, while they vary, they all end up resulting in significantly costly transactions when they've exceeded a certain threshold of scaling. So part of the reason why Bitcoin and Ethereum are costing so much per transaction is that they've scaled to a larger audience, that they're trying to satisfy a larger number of transactions per second. And while the threshold of what TPS is becomes expensive, varies from blockchain to blockchain, that problem of scale exists in all of them. So if Dash were to become sufficiently popular, its transactions would also become more costly.
I think that there's a built-in mechanism to make that not have to be the case with Dash, particularly because Dash is geared. I mean, Ryan, you speak to this. This is not really the question of the route that I wanted to go down, but maybe
I'm just saying, when you talk about being sold on Dash but not the others, I'm saying that same problem applies to Dash. It's just that Dash right at this moment is not under such load that the cost per transaction is prohibitive.
I'll speak to that real quickly, because there is a slight distinction that's an important distinction with Dash, and I know of some other kind of copies of Dash that have done this. So Dash isn't unique in this, but most cryptocurrencies do face a problem with scalability that Dash doesn't, because of how Dash has designed its blockchain. So the classic problem with Bitcoin that has caused such controversy is scalability. How are we going to scale the number of users while also maintaining a degree of decentralization that people are comfortable with? And the argument is for the people on the big block size, and the reason the block size matters is the bigger the blocks you have, the more transactions you can stick in those blocks, the lower the fee per transaction in general. But the argument against the big blocks is that by creating such big blocks, it puts a lot of resource strain on the nodes running the network to process those blocks. And when you put a lot of strain on those nodes, then those nodes start becoming more expensive. And so you have people that were initially running a node just out of the excitement and generosity of their hearts, because it didn't cost that much. But once a node starts costing $50 a month, $100 a month, $1,000 a month, then you start getting fewer nodes on the network, which makes it centralized, which makes the network prone to centralization. So where before you might have had tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of nodes that could be on the network, now as the cost to run a node increases, the number of nodes starts dropping off to only those that are economically viable for some other reason. And so that's the problem that most blockchains face, is this trade-off between low transaction fees and decentralization. And the way that Dash has solved that is fairly simple when you hear it, but for some reason most blockchains don't do this. You need to pay the nodes to run the service, and you need to pay those nodes, not just mining nodes, but all the nodes, or at least some significant portion of the nodes. You need to pay them for running those nodes, and Dash does that by splitting the block reward. It doesn't just go to miners, it also goes to these node operators, which we call master node operators.
And that's the majority, isn't it? The majority of the reward goes to them.
Yes. But the allocation is a little bit tangential to the argument. The only thing that really needs to be said is that nodes are paid to run the network from the block subsidy. And so it's possible to scale out while also paying the nodes. And so when you're paying the nodes, they don't drop off as the number of transactions increases, because they're paid to stay in. And so you maintain the decentralization.
So the problem still exists that no matter how many nodes you have or how few nodes you have, even if your network is highly decentralized, you still have a sort of max number of transactions per second that you can synchronize across all of the nodes in that network before you start running up against actual inherent limitations of physics itself. So it's like, yes, having more node operators makes your network more decentralized, but you still have to sync up all of the transactions that appear in each block with all the nodes in that network. And having more of them actually can make that problem even more challenging rather than less so. So
True.
the argument about decentralization is really orthogonal to the argument about scalability. I mean, I hear what you're saying, in that by incentivizing, you're going to achieve greater decentralization. But this question of, like, at some point, you're going to run into full blocks or some sort of max number of transactions per second that you can reach. That's going to
Full
exist
blocks
on
is
Dash.
Yeah, full blocks is somewhat arbitrary, though, because once the blocks are full, if you need more block size, you can increase the block size. But your point
Well, but
is still valid, that at some point you're going to have
yeah,
too many transactions per second coming through for the nodes to efficiently validate and come to consensus on. And I take your point there. I just think that that's orders of magnitude higher than where Bitcoin, for example,
yeah, and
BTC
it
placed
may
that
be,
limit.
and I don't know exactly where that is. All I'm saying is every blockchain has that same problem, and every blockchain, if it becomes popular enough, will therefore hit a point at which the transactions are $40 per transaction, because if it gets popular enough, right? So my point is, yeah, that's just
That's so far into the future, though, that's not, I don't think,
So to
relevant.
Ryan,
Let
to
me
chime in real quick, guys. We're talking about scalability of different different blockchains and different coins, and my understanding of the goals of this discussion is to talk about the practical applications of blockchain to solve problems. And I understand that scalability actually does play an important role in that. And I'll just speak from my just Ryan just chimed in the chat, wanted to hear my perspective. I'm coming at this probably slightly behind where AJ is in his progression, in terms of like developing a deeper understanding of blockchain and its applications and limitations.
much more open-minded.
Yeah. That was going to be my next comment. But I'm coming at it in probably a more open-minded, with a more open-minded approach. And my imagination is starting to really kind of, with what can be done with blockchain, is starting to take shape loosely, but I'm like a kid in like a sandbox where I'm like, building sand castles and imagining what can be done. But I have a very limited understanding in terms of like the deeper layers of how the technology works. And so what I'm looking for, and I don't want to hijack this, but I am interested in personally just getting an explanation from Carl and Ryan, and AJ's perspective, of course, in in non-blockchain terminology, what types of practical real world problems that blockchain or distributed ledger technology can solve in a better way than the current solutions. And I've got ideas around that. I'm coming from the startup ecosystem, and I'm coming at from an angle of startups and really streamlining the whole life cycle of a startup and the experience of forming, founding, capitalizing, scaling, and exiting from a startup. So that's one angle that I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it from the fund side of investors that are trying to put money into these startups. And then there's a legal aspect to all of this that I probably am not the best person to speak to, but I have questions and concerns on the legality of really building investment process or business process around blockchain technologies. And so that's where I'm coming from, and I have specific examples and use cases that I'm curious to hear about. But I just want to just chime in real quick and just say I would love to drive the discussion towards some of that. Even though I think the scalability conversation really seems quite important.
So if I can,
just real quick, the only reason I touched on that for a while was mostly because of AJ's assertion that he's convinced about the utility of Dash and not the others. I was just trying to universalize, genericize that, and say basically, like, if you are convinced that Dash is valid because it has a faster TPS, that same argument can be applied to several other blockchains and or not, but they all have a point at which they stop scaling. So, but I think we've touched on that enough, so we don't have to keep going on that. So,
okay. Yeah. Just a few things before we go. I want to acknowledge a few comments, one of which is relevant to the discussion we were just having. And I think I'm hoping that we can get just a little short discussion, and then I'd like to move back in that direction that Matt was talking about. So our good friend Elon says 99% of people who buy crypto are in it to get rich. The other 0.99% are already rich, and 0.1% are nerds doing talks like this. And he's a troll. So, but he brings up a good point, and I just want to acknowledge that. Yes, I believe the same thing, which is why I was 100% against all this stuff when we came in at the last debate. But this conversation is meant to be taking it seriously and not just talk about the hype train, but talk about, do we really have some technology here that has uses that solves real problems? That's what this debate is trying to drive towards. So yeah, this is not the debate to help people that want to get rich figure out which is the best next scam to invest in. Then Sean was asking right from the beginning about layer 2 versus layer 1. And he clarified his question. Let me see if I can grab the most succinct version of it. Is it better to add a layer to a blockchain to add functions and reduce the cost of transactions? Or is it better to start from scratch and design a new blockchain? Or I'm going to add update the protocol, which is one of the things that some blockchains do, is that they update the protocol in order to accomplish those goals. So I'm going to put that as a third option there. But if we can hit on that briefly to satisfy that question, then I'd like to move on with what Matt was talking about.
I think it's relevant to the point that Matt was making, actually, because a lot of blockchains, their original purpose of a blockchain was cryptocurrency. But as people started to explore the technology of distributed consensus and blockchains and whatnot, they discovered, well, you can do other things with them. And so early on in Bitcoin's day, people were putting data into the blocks that represent other things other than the coin supply. And so we started seeing the emergence of these different protocols that were tapping into the base layer protocol, but they are separate protocols. And so Vitalik Buterin was one such person who, liked this idea and wanted to keep going with this and wanted to basically optimize Bitcoin so that it could, put these kind of ideas into the overall design of Bitcoin. But some people in Bitcoin thought, no, we want to keep Bitcoin just a cryptocurrency. And so, long story short, he ultimately decided to create his own blockchain, which we now know as Ethereum, and it optimizes for exactly what we're talking about, these different protocols where you can create what are essentially stocks, on the blockchain. And Carl can speak more to this, but people are finding these different use cases, and whether those use cases are done at layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, I think that was the question. So I can get back to that. That's
like
an engineering
Lightning Network versus Dash has a system that adjusts.
Yeah. So Lightning Network is an example of a layer 2. So it's something where there's a different network that communicates with the layer 1 for certain types of consensus, but it's also got its own little thing going that's essentially separate from the main consensus. So that's what layers means, if anybody's unfamiliar with that term.
And to clarify just a little bit, they're called layers because they really are anchored and founded on the thing below them, right? And so it's important to point out that Lightning Network still ultimately, basically what it does is batch up a lot of transactions and then provide some cryptographic proof that those transactions were executed successfully and anchor that proof in a layer 1 transaction. So in other words, you're getting many, many transactions for just one, right? And that just is one way of scaling beyond the limits of what layer 1 can do. And so when the person's asking whether or not you should invent your own blockchain or do layer 2, a layer 2 solution, the answer there is that all blockchains will eventually hit a scaling limit, a ceiling of some kind. And if you want to go beyond that, layer 2 is pretty much the main way people do it. It's the only game in town.
So I want to understand.
It's kind of like a business. It's kind of like a business organization. They happen in layers too, because the CEO can't see everything that every employee is doing. So people have layers of management that do kind of the same thing. It's the same idea. Scalability in general has this problem, not just blockchains, but anything that has to scale out has to have some kind of layering system at some point. And so anyway, I just wanted to add that this is not just a blockchain specific problem.
There's an interesting analogy to the world that I operate in, where syndication of investment happens quite frequently. And the idea is you have a bunch of investors that are writing smaller checks, and they're investing them into a central, into what's called a special purpose vehicle, or an LLC, consolidates a bunch of smaller checks into one through one vehicle, and then that is invested into a company as one big check. And it's not overly, it's just kind of interesting. Like it's analogous, I'd say, where there's a bunch of reasons why syndication and special purpose vehicles are used really broadly in the investment world. But anyway, it's
cool. It's an interesting analogy.
So with the Lightning Network, for Bitcoin specifically, is what that's doing. Many people want to make many transactions. So say there's 5 people that want to transact with 5 completely different people. So they submit their desire to the Lightning Network that they trust somehow. Then the Lightning Network tells them, I guess, how to sign some stuff, probably. And then it takes the inputs from the 5 people, all of the inputs from the 5 people, and then takes all of the specified outputs to the other 5 people, and then it submits one transaction, but everybody's transactions are in the one transaction so that the fee stays low. Is that how Lightning works?
Yeah, that's my layperson's understanding of how the Lightning Network works. That it essentially, on some other place, there's a record of all those transactions, and they're all accounted for, but then there's some sort of proof of the transactions having been executed that is then anchored to layer 1. So on layer 1, you don't have all the details of all the transactions. The details of the transactions are stored on the Lightning Network and not on the layer 1 network, right? But they all get kind of crunched down, if you will, into a single transaction on the main Bitcoin blockchain, so that you can, have several orders of magnitude more transactions per second. But one really important point to make here is just that this works easily in Bitcoin because all Bitcoin does, for the most part, is debits and credits. It's really simple. Debits and credits are not are not nearly as temporally dependent as other. As long as you're not doing debits and credits between the same individual in out of order, basically you can have lots and lots of transactions that don't that don't interfere with each other, all in the same batch, right? That gets a lot harder in a Turing complete blockchain like Ethereum, because as anyone who's ever programmed a computer knows, code depends on the state of code before it and often looks up memory. And so you never know in a given transaction whether it's going to need memory that's from a calculation that's already been performed or not. And so you have tons of temporal dependencies in Turing complete blockchains that make it a lot harder to just throw all the transactions together and execute them in any order you want, right? So it can't scale as easily. Layer 2 doesn't necessarily scale as easily, but it's a similar concept. It can be done. And there are layer 2 solutions for Ethereum. But once again, they're Turing complete. They allow you to express all the business logic you want in arbitrary complexity, and ultimately do a bunch of stuff, get the result, create a proof of the result, and anchor it to layer 1.
Okay. So last time we joked about Twitch plays Pokemon on Ethereum. That you could send some arbitrary commands to do some arbitrary stuff. And, well, actually, let me back up. So is it fair to say that things that are more similar to Bitcoin are pretty much only useful for monetary transactions, but things that are more similar to Ethereum could potentially have more? Well, they've got to be able to have more uses because they're Turing complete. You can write they have a programming language that they can run a distributed algorithm.
That's generally true. That's basically accurate. The only thing I would add is that Bitcoin does actually have lots of opcodes that can be used to support the kind of things we're talking about, but they were done in such a primitive way that nobody wants to use these sort of vestigial opcodes in Bitcoin because they're just really hard to work with. It is possible to write smart contracts in Bitcoin in a very limited way, but it's pretty much not done these days.
So can I compile Wasm for Ethereum?
So there are. I don't think this is done too much in Ethereum itself, but there are several EVM compatible blockchains. That's Ethereum Virtual Machine is what EVM stands for. There are blockchains that could run Ethereum code on Wasm-based nodes. So it's a little different than what you seemed to be describing, but it's like the nodes themselves are running Wasm in some way, and they're designed to I guess make it even that much easier to use an arbitrary programming language when you write your smart contracts and things like that. Yeah, and Josue just mentioned that Cosmos uses Rust or Go. I can't remember if Cosmos is Wasm based, but some people are using Wasm for validator nodes in blockchain contexts.
And for those that are not aware, Wasm is web assembly. So it's an artificial machine code. So it's an artificial CPU set of CPU instructions that is essentially it's similar to the idea of a virtual machine. So you could take any programming language from C to Java to Go to Rust, etc. Rust being the most popular because of the feature set that kind of closely aligns with the kind of things you'd want to do for it. But it allows you to ship binary code to browsers on different platforms. So, for example, Linux, Mac, Windows, and have that binary code be able to run both efficiently, much more efficiently than it would in a virtual machine like the Java virtual machine, but also still be cross-platform.
One other point worth making here is that there will always be a limit, no matter how efficient your virtual machine is. There will always be a limit to how many transactions you can synchronize across the distributed network of blockchain nodes. And so even if you have this really awesome Wasm interpreter, a lot of the challenges are around what's called the mempool. The mempool is what holds all the pending transactions and that gets propagated from node to node of like all these transactions want to be added to the blockchain, and each node gets to decide sort of how it's going to add those transactions and according to certain protocol rules. And so there are limitations of scale even if you have a really fast or really efficient code running on your individual nodes. So Wasm provides certain flexibility for blockchain implementations, and it's popular because it's kind of an emerging standard, but it's limited in terms of like how well it lets you scale to higher transaction rates.
Okay, so one of the main limitations of most blockchains is the number of transactions that you can process per second. Obviously, there's some real limit at some point, but some of those limits are fairly artificial. We don't have to have the limits in the same way that we do, but whatever is stored on a block has to be stored on disk somewhere. So if you have lots of transactions, then you're going to have to store those transactions on disk, no matter whether or not you limit the number of transactions per block. So that's one of the limitations of a blockchain. And Geek Hunger asks, in regards to the speed performance of blockchains, what are some of the sane applications? And again, I think this goes back to my previous question and Matt's question. Can we drive back towards, so outside of just money, what is something that a blockchain can be used for in the real world? Something that's not just theoretical, not oh well, if everybody in the world adopted this, but some organization or some company or some collective that currently can benefit from that technology in the real world as it exists today, or in the emerging virtual only / Web3 world that exists today.
I think just real quick, I mean, I'm even okay to say that these are practical problems that we're solving with kind of a contained network effect, where we're operating under the premise that at least two parties that are transacting in some way, but it could be like an organization or a community. There's different kind of layers to network effects. But anyway, that's I think just one quick point I wanted to make is that I'm okay with if it does require a group of people that are opting into to transact in through the blockchain, but definitely looking for practical solutions.
I think it kind of depends on what your business model is aiming for. Like if your business model, because we don't want to get into a situation where we have a solution and we're going to look for a problem to solve, right? Solutions seeking problems is generally not a good idea.
And that's been my complaint primarily.
Yeah, but on the
has-
other hand, you also don't want to go to the other extreme where you say, well, I'm not going to try anything with new technology if I don't have a problem, because many innovations aren't innovations because they're solving a problem that people knew they had. They're innovations because they solve a problem that people didn't even know they had. And that's that, you know, you think of the iPhone, like nobody really consciously thought I need a touch screen in my hand, but somebody anticipated a problem, or at least anticipated a solution that would cause other people to think, oh, I have that problem too now. I want one of those things. So you can't go to either extreme, problem seeking solution and the other extreme. So you start with your business, you start with your innovation, you start with your business question. Is this an idea that requires open access? Does this require a large network? Are there network effects that we're chasing? If those two questions, and I haven't really thought this fully through, but those are just kind of some questions that come to mind that would say it might be interesting to look at blockchain as a solution to this, because the whole nature of blockchains is that it's solving a distributed consensus, where open access and distributed consensus. And so if you have a business that's just like, I have a client server relationship and that's all that matters, there's no reason to put blockchain in this. You just, you know, you just have a server, normal client server model. But on the other hand, if you want to design something where you want to give open access to anybody in the world to write to this database, and you want anybody also to be able to participate in the consensus around coming to consensus on what the state of that database is, and be permissioned only by the fee that they have to pay to write to that database, then you're talking about something that looks a lot like a blockchain. Or I always hate to call it a blockchain, because as Carl said, you know, these aren't all blockchains, and blockchain is just the data structure, but the distributed consensus is the question to ask.
So I was going to just suggest that I have a set of like about 7 or 8 slides that show the various layers that every application needs, no matter what application you're talking about. And it might be an interesting way of conceptualizing how blockchain can potentially benefit any type of application. That's not to say that every application is appropriate for blockchain, but I think that seeing the application layers that typically are needed and then seeing how blockchain does them versus how they're currently done actually is a kind of eye-opening process. I mean, if you want, I could take a couple minutes on that, but I mean, I don't want to derail the conversation.
Well, this is just right now. This is just frustrating to me, because this is the same thing that always happens. We say, okay, well, what's a practical use case? And the hype train is all about, well, it applies to everything. It's going to revolutionize the whole world. It's going to revolutionize everything. And Ryan says, no, it doesn't revolutionize everything. But so far, neither of you have produced something that is that. And I even gave you the prompt from last time. You said GPS data and weather.
I think he's trying to educate us on the broader benefits of blockchain for
but just give me
one thing.
Just give me one thing to start.
What Matt said is, I'm trying to lay a foundation, and what's happening is that if I give you one thing, it's kind of like I'm speaking a language you haven't learned yet, and so it's like
Carl, how long would it take you to go through that presentation?
Let's do it.
How long would it take? You said a couple minutes.
I think I could do it in 2 or 3 minutes. I think 2 or 3 minutes.
Let's
if I really hurry.
And then let's jump into some practical.
If I'm interrupted all the way through, then it might take longer. But I think I can do it in 2 or 3 minutes.
I'll be quiet at least.
Well, I will ask questions as I feel the need to ask questions. But a quick word from our sponsor, that I guess being me. If you like this content, consider a like, sub, follow, whatever. I've got my little reminder set off to remind me to tell people that, because if you don't ask people, then
educate us, Carl. I like this.
All right. Okay. Oh, and let me get my face out of the way of the other Mabob. There we go. Right. And I'm going to remove the chat temporarily as well.
Rather than sharing my entire screen, I'm just going to share my window and bounce through the slides with the little thumbnails. So forgive me. Right now, in Web 2, when you need to use the internet, your address can be seen and people can pinpoint your location on the globe. You can already imagine several ways in which that might be an invasion of privacy and might cause some problems in existing systems. In blockchains, we use a peer-to-peer overlay where the individual nodes on the blockchain are not traceable to a specific geolocation. So we're already providing a greater level of privacy for node addressing.
Now that
Blockchain,
does come at the cost of being slow.
a little bit slower, but in many cases it's still fine. Blockchains, we also have this problem, generally speaking, in our applications where we need memorable names for things rather than referring always to things as numbers, and where we also need abstraction where we can like use the same name even if we swap out the number of the address number underneath that thing. And we use DNS for this, but DNS is centralized and hierarchical. There's a single worldwide body that's in charge of all of it.
It's decentralized and hierarchical.
But there's still worldwide bodies that can prevent you from having certain domain names and can take domain names away from you. And blockchain-based versions of the same do not have that limitation.
But what is one that exists that
ENS.
works?
ENS works right now. It
Okay,
exists.
I'm looking this up because I'm really interested in this conceptually. I know Brave supports one, but then I actually looked into it and it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, this totally works. You can use it right now.
Ethereum name service?
Yes.
And
All right.
Just real quick, what browsers does it work in, or how do I, or do I install something on my computer to get it to work, or how could someone, if I get an ENS, how can somebody else access it?
It basically involves actually looking things up on the blockchain itself to see where an address points to. And an address can point to any number of things. It could point to a Web 2 IP address. It could point to another smart contract. So there's a variety of things that it can point to.
But how, if I had something and somebody else wanted to use it, and I'd say, hey, just go look it up on the Ethereum blockchain, or is it usable?
Yeah, it totally is usable. The use cases for it are growing, but they're there already. I mean, like I said,
I believe in the use case.
So
but
I
what
can
I
have
don't
an
understand
NFT,
is,
for example, and I can refer to that NFT with a memorable name rather than some gobbledygook 48 character base 64 address.
and I 100% want this. How do I use it? How is it possible to use it?
You need to actually have a wallet installed in your browser. You need to have MetaMask or something like that. And it can be either a hardware wallet or a software wallet. And you interact with the ENS app, which is actually, you just browse to that specific ENS address, which you can find by Googling. And you can register a domain name and then tell it where you want it to point people to. And the location can be Web 2 storage, like a URL, a normal URL, or it could be Web 3 storage, like I'm about to tell you what that is. Okay, Web 3 storage.
Just 1 second, because I'm looking this up as we're doing it. I'm using the Brave browser, which I consider to be a fairly mainstream browser. I type in example.eth in my browser. It asks, enable support of Ethereum name service in Brave. And then it says, if you enable this, Cloudflare will see the .eth domain that you're trying to visit, but they will not be able to see other domains.
Yeah, so what you're seeing there is that Brave is choosing a Cloudflare portal for accessing some information that's available on the Ethereum blockchain, but it would be possible to do that through other means. And the portal, in a way, is kind of centralized in the sense that everyone has to use Cloudflare if they're doing that. But it is kind of a bridge to Web3 right now.
Okay, so I could get a browser plugin. So if I had an ETH domain, basically I would tell my constituency, install MetaMask in Chrome, and you'll be able to go to these .eth domains, or use the Brave browser and you'll be able to go to these .eth domains. Do you know of any ETH domains? Because I just tried example.eth, nothing. www.eth, nothing.
So I have a couple that I've registered myself. They're right now kind of in a holding pattern. They're mostly just my own name. I just wanted to secure my own last name. But you know, like there are lots of people who are using them to point to a little NFT that has stats about themselves, or to their blog, like which is stored on IPFS.
Do you know of any of them specifically?
I mean, I'd have to no. I mean, like right off the top of my head, no. But like, I don't know.
I think we gotta move a little faster if we're gonna get through these slides, and we don't have time to go through all the internals of all of these slides, AJ. Right?
But this is the thing. This is a
Just let him give you
practical
an
use case.
overview
I
of the
want to know,
problem that you're
does it
going
work?
to, AJ.
What?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm just
fine.
saying,
I'll look
this
up
is
an
a
ENS
practical
name for you.
problem.
Yeah, this is a real practical problem. This
Yeah,
is what I want to get into. And if this works, and I can say to the people that are watching this right now, hey, this works. You can use this today. That's valuable.
Yeah,
Right?
no,
Because
no,
this is something
I
that's
wouldn't
real.
even go that far, though. Just because something works doesn't mean it's valuable, but it's the right start.
Okay, well, my point is, it's worth it to me to stop and say, okay, you've introduced something. If it's a real practical solution, which I believe that having a name service that is not, DNS is distributed. You can read the declarations of whatever it is that you subscribe to. So .com is one of the most liberal in the dictionary definition of what liberal meant as of 1990, meaning it is the most permissive, one of the most permissive. Some of the other ones are extremely restrictive. As far as I know, .com, .net, .org, and believe it or not, .gop are the most liberal top-level domains that have the fewest rules and are the least likely to shut you down from government pressure, etc. And then as you go into the other ones, they all have their own terms of service, and some of them have terribly horrific things, such as an unspecified, you can't use this top-level domain for hate speech, whatever that means, right? So I do believe that we need a solution to this problem for the purpose of free speech. And that to me is extremely practical. And if somebody knew of any domain that I could type into my browser, because my browser supposedly supports this, so if I could just see it on any domain working, I would be floored. I would go get one of these today.
Okay.
I just need to
got
see
one.
that it does work. What have you got?
Just piddling around, but I found this.
Share your screen, AJ, if you're going to it.
Well, Carl's going to it.
Oh, I mean, so I'd have to switch
Carl's
which
only
screen I'm
showing
sharing.
one.
Oh,
I don't
since
mind
I'm managing the recording and stuff,
Okay, I
don't.
can share it. Just a
Okay.
sec.
Yeah.
Brave, where's that thing? Sorry.
Somebody says ENS still lives on ICANN TLD. I think that ENS may have been purchased as a TLD. I'm not sure, but I don't think it lives
Okay, so here you go.
on ICANN.
This is Brantley.eth, and he has some stuff about himself on his domain, his ENS domain.
Okay, and I can get there too. So I can get there in a mainstream browser. This is amazing. The only thing that's not amazing is that it's not secure, and I guess we'd have to learn why that is later. But this is cool. This is awesome. I'm excited about this. I'm really interested in learning more afterwards. So thank you.
Yeah, there are some other things that could be done to validate that the content you're getting from him is what he intended for it to be. But yeah, that's a good point, that right at this moment, the standard TLS certificate is a different model than what's being used there. Okay, I'm going to quickly bounce to the other slides because I think it's important to do just to touch on a few more topics, if that's all right.
Yeah,
Stop
go
sharing
ahead.
my screen window. Here we go. Share.
And then I'm just going to catch up on a few comments real quick. Somebody had said something about Airweave protocol for storage. I think we're kind of past that.
Well, I'm actually going to get to that in a second.
Great.
So identity is another really important thing that Web3 is starting to fix. And for self-sovereign identity, you have three roles basically. You have an issuer of credentials, an owner or holder of credentials, which would be you, and a verifier of credentials. And each of them has a pairwise relationship with each other that ensures that any data that they exchange with each other cannot be cross-correlated with any data that someone else has about you. So this prevents a lot of problems that currently exist in the way that cookies work and other things like that. And I don't have time to go into more detail there, but this is a really important feature that will be critical, not just to Web3 technologies, but to our entire existence on the internet going forward.
And this is something
AJ,
that
just
we should
to
talk
say
about.
something real quick about this.
Yeah.
This is exactly what I was describing to you with the sign in. No one wants to sign in with Google anymore.
So
People
I
want to sign in with their own credentials and own their own identity,
I have
or at least they will in the future.
a presentation that I'd put together on this called OAuth 3, but this is maybe something we should discuss in more detail in another one, or circle back around if we have
Sure.
time.
I
Because
have
this
another
is something.
presentation I can share on this as well someday.
My good
Okay.
friend Riley Hughes is the CEO and founder of Trinsic, if that's
Oh yeah,
relevant.
that's awesome. Trinsic is doing great work
I'm sure he'd be interested
in this
joining.
space.
Intrinsic is the evolution of Sovereign, right?
No,
Is they
Trinsic is another company that relies on some of the same standards that Sovereign was building.
okay?
So next thing, basically, really quick, payments was the first use case of blockchain, and so I'm going to skip over that. We've been talking about that a lot. Comms is another interesting one. This is only getting started, but the idea here is that you could now have communications protocols that had additional privacy features that were surveillance resistant and censorship resistant. This is just one example, but I could use the same nodes in a blockchain to send packets of data to an intended recipient. In this case, AC is talking to BC, but I could send them in a way where their final destination was occluded in the packet, and the packet itself is encrypted in a way that only BC can decrypt it. But it gets broadcast to every address that matches B underscore. And so in this particular case, because every node is receiving a copy of the packet, it's difficult for somebody who wishes to censor those communications to block the communications because they just are spreading across the entire network.
Okay, so you get efficiency because you can give a prefix that could maybe go to 1,000 systems, and that's not going to slow it down at all.
Well, it still does cost actual bandwidth on the network. And there's nothing preventing you from doing a system like this on a custom peer-to-peer network that is not a blockchain. But the point is that blockchain would enable you to incentivize every node in this chain and reward it for its resource, for using its resources to help the network to function.
Okay, so this is, well, I'm not 100% sure on that. That sounds a little theoretical, but we talked about the VPN service last time, and this sounds like a service in kind. We're incentivized to stay on it because as I'm transacting more messages, I'm getting coin that basically says I can spend that coin to transact messages.
That's right. Same thing here, and here's where the Arweave question comes in. File storage is another thing that every application needs. Right now, we have to rely on either cloud services or on our own machine running our own server to make an app that works on the internet. With blockchain, it's possible to create incentivized distributed networks where each node in the network stores data packets, stores blobs of data for someone who wants them stored. And we can actually cryptographically verify that they're storing them properly and slash them if they aren't storing them properly, which would be to confiscate their rewards. And essentially, because they're rewarded with crypto, they have a strong incentive to store your blobs for you. And yet you can store your blobs redundantly across several peers in the network without having to rely on any individual peer or company that's providing you storage, so that your storage is theoretically a lot more censorship resistant and more redundant and more kind of failure sort of recovers better from failure, right?
So question on the censorship resistant, because I everybody talks about blockchain and censorship resistant or privacy or whatever, but I actually see, to me, it seems that it's going to be the opposite, right? Because every transaction is in a ledger. We did say that there are some that don't have a ledger, but if so many transactions are in a ledger, even in that case that you presented previously where you say, well, it goes out to 1,000 of them. Well, I would imagine if you were watching the network and you're on the network and you're seeing all of these things broadcast, you could just keep track of, okay, a B underscore went to some system B XXX, and then later B XXX replied to.
That's not what's stored on the network in that particular example. The packets are ephemeral and they're not stored on the blockchain at all. What's stored on the blockchain is just IOU for services. Basically, all the blockchain is used is to handle payments between nodes for services rendered and services received.
Okay, so the IOU system. And I
Yeah.
really like that you use that term because I came up with that term a couple weeks ago in a conversation with Ryan. And that's kind of how I see a lot of these digital payments is it's IOU for services in kind.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so same thing can be done with file storage, and then apps also need random access queries, right? Blobs, just storing a giant blob, isn't as easy to query little pieces of that blob and update little pieces of the blob without having to re-upload the entire blob. And that's where databases come in. And same deal with those. We currently rely on cloud services or running your own server to get those to work. But if your cloud provider, punts you or kicks you off, or your server goes down, right? That can be a single point of failure. But blockchain allows us to create distributed databases that are stored on several machines. Your query goes out to several nodes that are replicating the same table, and they all come back and give you the result of the query. And you could think of it as a virtual database in the cloud, but each node is getting paid for the amount of data it's storing and the amount of queries it's servicing for you, right?
So
AJ, this is exactly when we've talked about Dash Platform. This is exactly what Dash Platform is all about. It's storing data on these nodes. In Dash's case, it is a layer 2 blockchain. So to tie it back to that, it's a layer 2 that ties back into the Dash's layer 1. It's SDK, it's Cosmos SDK.
And I'm just about done. I'm just going to go to one final thing that apps always need. And this is that they need some way of performing computation when the device is offline, or just because the device is like small and we want to perform it on a beefier machine that can do more work for us. Right now we're relying on cloud services again for that. Or sometimes, you might have a weird desktop app that is running as a companion to your mobile app that is like somehow chugging away, but that's pretty rare. In blockchain, we're creating networks of independent nodes that is offering their computing services. And we have two ways of maintaining data privacy in that mode of operation. We can use the secure enclave in modern CPUs to encrypt a data packet in a way that only the secure enclave of the destination node can decrypt it and execute some sort of code that's embedded in it, return the result in an encrypted way that is encrypted in a way that only the requester of the computation can decrypt. That's kind of a poor man's version that works in the secure enclaves that we have right now. And then there's also something called homomorphic encryption, which is like orders of magnitude slower than regular computation, but allows us to send data or to have computation performed by a third party without them even being able to read the underlying data that's performed on that computation.
So a lot of this stuff it really doesn't have anything to do with blockchain. We're just using plain old 1970 style public key pair encryption.
Well, so the main point here is that prior to blockchains being invented, we had no good way of creating sustainable networks for payments, communications, file storage, data services, computing services because we couldn't incentivize their maintenance and operation and upkeep, right? So
the blockchain provides the IOU for the service in kind.
That's exactly
That's
right.
the innovation.
That's the big innovation, as well as just it's a good record keeping system, right? Like anything like a financial transaction that we want to have real good trust that it actually happened, blockchain is good for that.
Okay. All right. And then once we get away from proof of work and we're looking at proof of service and proof of stake, I am more bought into these use cases, especially when we're, referencing it as we're not trying to make all this stuff be quote unquote on a blockchain. We're trying to keep a service in kind IOU record. So that I'm down with that. Now I do have another question, which I guess this is now tangential, and let me get the chat in my face back. So right now we've got a war going on, and there's a lot of good Russian people that are just good family people trying to do their work to, just do normal stuff. They don't have any ill will towards anybody else in the world. They're just heads down trying to mind their own business. And some of them do work online, and some of them would like to get paid digitally, or like to be able to offer online services and be paid in kind in online services. And we have a lot of nefarious people in the world, some of whom I believe are in the US government and in every government, because there's always nefarious people in any large system that attracts power. And we just got some crackdowns from our government that are trying to identify digital transactions that are happening with Russia and then punish US citizens for doing that. And the real losers here are the US citizens and the Russian citizens, not anybody that's, supposedly involved in the conflict. With that, this is a big concern for me in terms of the privacy and the censorship resistance. I mean, if I can go to jail for paying someone in Russia in a cryptocurrency for a VPN service, or for them to create a logo for me, I don't know what my question is, but is this really going to help us?
So I have a related answer, and it's related to what you said, but it's not exactly the same. But I think it's really worth pointing out that the Ukrainian war has been an absolute vindication for crypto, right? Absolute vindication in the sense that, and let's talk about just on the Ukrainian side. We can now, the keynote speaker at a conference that I recently organized has actually been with Joe Biden when he had to fly out to Georgia when Georgia originally got attacked to do some sort of like recovery after that whole situation, right? And the difficulty of emergency aid at that time was such that they would just send pallets of cash, pallets of $100 bills into these countries that needed aid, and they would hope that some of it got to its intended destination, right? But they factored in that at least 40% of it gets lost because of bribery, because of all sorts of money, grabby hands that are taking it along the way and that are greasing the wheels as it gets to where it needs to go. And with Ukraine, what we saw was that with crypto, anybody, any individual or government or group of, philanthropic group, whatever, could publish an ETH or a BTC address or whatever kind of address, and we could know for certain that the cash got to the recipient that it was intended for in real time, and they could also affirm the same on their end. And we just bypassed so much red tape that it was just absolutely clear that for emergency aid, crypto is a total win.
Well, but what about the people in Russia, though? Because the people, the individuals, the families of Russia are not my enemy.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And my government has said that I will be prosecuted if I do business with someone who is a friend of mine or someone that I believe can deliver me value in Russia. And they are specifically have announced that they are tracking blockchain traffic.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is, more challenging, right? But it's really regulatory. I mean, this is the same. The same rule exists if you try to send dollars to somebody in Iran right now, right? That rule has been in place since the revolution that occurred several decades ago. So it's not like these particular problems are blockchain specific. What you're talking about is sanctions, your economic sanctions, right?
Well, yeah, but the idea of the privacy, the censorship resistant. I don't feel if I want, and actually I do want to buy stuff from people in Russia. My wife is Latvian. Predominantly the Blu-rays and DVDs that are available with Latvian dubbing come from Russia, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've been, prior to the sanctions, I had been buying Russian DVDs from Russia and from Ukraine because we want our children to be able to learn her language, and an easy way to do that is to put those on the TV. So I personally want to be able to transact with good normal people in Russia, and I can't. And obviously I'm not going to do that because I don't want to go to jail, and it's not worth going to jail to get a Russian.
Well, you
Get
can.
DVDs.
You can technologically is the point. You can technologically, and you'll never get through the regulation side of things without. That's always going to be an
But-
issue, and blockchains don't solve
And
the
it's
fact
fair
that some
though.
people have guns and will point them at you for doing things they don't like.
But
No
it is-
technology will solve that.
It is fair to point out that blockchain gives a really nice ledger for governments to track, right? So this is one challenge that currently exists in blockchains, which is that most blockchains currently don't have built-in privacy. You don't necessarily see the identity of the person who is doing the transaction, but it's pretty easy to find them by seeing all the different wallets they're interacting with and seeing which exchanges they use as off ramps, right? So it's possible, for example, to submit a subpoena to Coinbase for whatever transaction this was, and if you have probable cause, and you can prove to Coinbase that or you have a subpoena, which we hope the judge only granted after probable cause was demonstrated. Then it's possible for you to identify who that money actually went to, right? And blockchains in some ways make it easier. The FBI and others love blockchains because it is easier to trace laundered money and drug money and other stuff like that in blockchains. But I would argue that there are, like you say, totally legitimate above board use cases that you still want to keep private, right? And
Yeah,
for
so governments love blockchains without privacy, is what you're saying.
right,
So this is an issue of privacy. So if your
Right.
blockchain provides privacy,
it's
then
being worked on. Is
problem-
all I was going to say. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I'm going to say. It's still early days, and the privacy issues are difficult, but they are being worked on. And blockchains, I expect, will eventually make it so that it's possible for you to truly behave like cash, where you can go and you can exchange cash privately with somebody, and they don't have to know that transaction took place, right?
Yeah, so somebody in the chat said something to the effect of Monero fixes this, which is, that's the idea, is any blockchain that really wants to be digital cash and used as digital cash needs privacy. And you can achieve that on second layer networks.
Yeah, that's true.
You can achieve that through the layer ones as well. And so things like Monero, things like Zcash, things like Dash are doing the layer one privacy. So yeah, that is being worked on.
So before I continue with that, I quickly want to acknowledge some comments. Most importantly, Carl, do you have a link to you having given that presentation? Could you share a Google Doc link or some other type of link to that presentation that we could put in the chat?
Yeah, I've got something that's decent for that. Let me grab that. I'll get on that.
Great. Yeah, because we had, I don't know how to pronounce it. It was Wowie. wanted to have that, and I agree. This would be great to have that presentation, and especially you giving that presentation would be really awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see. Geek Hunger said a few things. Some of these are a little bit far back, so I'm not going to go into that right now. LCC Dom was the one that was mentioning Monero. And I agree with Geek Hunger here. The crypto exchange can work pretty well up until the point that it has to hit cash, because once it hits cash, then that's when it's available to the governments and they can go back every single transaction. And this is something I want to ask you, Ryan. My understanding is that a lot of these quote unquote privacy features, such as CoinJoin, are really just putting your money up to be traded back and forth with others, so that to the casual person, it's maybe a little bit more difficult to trace back to the genesis. But my understanding with Dash, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you take any transaction at its end point, you can 100% chase it back 100% all the way to its beginning point. Or maybe beginning points, because maybe if you subdivide it so little, then maybe it can come from many different places. But that if you just look at transactions, this is true of any network. You can determine who the players are just by watching. If everything's anonymous, if you just watch nodes fire back and forth at each other, you can determine which were the relevant players in any given transaction.
Well, the whole idea behind CoinJoin is that you can't. If you've mixed these transactions sufficiently, meaning you've performed multiple rounds of coin mixing before you send your coins to the intended recipient, you can't. It's infeasible to trace back to see what was the actual origin of those coins.
But how? Because it seems, coins in, coins out. Coins weren't generated. Coins didn't disappear.
It's kind of like have you ever seen the guy on the street who does the coconut trick where he like says where's the ball, and he like moves his hands around really fast?
Well, yeah, but if you can put it in slow motion because you've got a computer that can just look at all the transactions.
So
I think that's a discussion that's a little
that's
bit
an analogy,
beyond.
But the basic analogy is like if you subdivide the value of that transaction into thousands of little pieces, and then you have like thousands of coconuts, and you switch those all around, you can obfuscate it to the point where it's really difficult to say whose funds are whose, but each person ends up with the same amount that they started out with.
Well, minus transaction fees, right?
Just think of it as a simplified model. Yeah. Think of, you have the four of us, or maybe just make it a little bit more real. Let's say that you've got 100 people, and everybody throws $1 into a pot, and then somebody mixes that up, and then you do that again, where everybody throws another $1 in, and you do that again. I'm not the best at explaining these privacy things, but then you pull one of those dollars out to pay your bar tab or whatever. Nobody knows which dollar came from which person. You just know that the dollars in equals the dollars out, but you don't know which dollar came from which person. That's the idea of coin mixing. And I just wanted to note that coin mixing isn't the only way to achieve privacy. So, those Monero fans and Zcash fans would not appreciate me not mentioning that.
And so those are the ones that don't have ledgers.
So
they do.
And again, I'm not a privacy expert, but Monero, they make a trade-off where you don't actually. I probably shouldn't speak to this because I don't know the technologies well enough, but they essentially take away information. They take away information so that you can't actually audit 100% to make sure that the coins, you can't 100% know what the coin supply is, because you just don't know the data about these transactions at all. That's why if you look at as far as I know, there's no real block explorers for Monero. There might be block explorers, but they don't have the kind of data that you would see in a block explorer like Dash or like Bitcoin or something, because you just don't know the amounts that are going in. And Zcash is a little bit different. Zcash has a technology called zero knowledge proofs, where you actually do know the data going in, and you know the data going out, but you don't have any knowledge of what happened in between. So that's where the zero knowledge part is. And so it gives you the privacy plus the ability to audit the coin supply, for example. But yeah, there's different ways to achieve privacy, and they all have their trade-offs.
Yeah, some of them don't have actual ledgers, right? Like,
Well, it'd be awesome if we could get some experts. If y'all know some experts and we could continue a part 3 and talk about privacy specifically, I'd love to do that.
yeah,
Sure,
one other
yeah.
thing I'll also mention is that based on my, experience, the exchange support for truly private blockchains isn't nearly as good as the support for blockchains that can be traced more easily. Um, I They're not, like, for example, there are not nearly as many exchanges that support Monero as some other more traceable blockchain, more traceable cryptocurrencies. So that's kind of one interesting anecdote there. I think
Okay.
that a lot of them are avoiding it because they're kind of scared of the legal liabilities involved.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, my eyes, between the last time we had this debate and now, and between conversations that I've had with Ryan, things that have been going on politically, my eyes have been opened a ton to some real problems in the world. And the promise, again, what the hype train says, and we talked about cherry picking. I think the problem with the hype train is that they don't cherry pick, they take everything regardless of what the trade-offs are, and then present it as if all blockchain technology succeeds on all levels. They're all maximum privacy and all maximum efficiency and all, they kind of present it as if we have a unicorn, and really each of these technologies have trade-offs, and it's hard to find one that may have the right trade-offs for any given situation, especially the situations we face, especially with regulatory concerns, where governments are really it seems to be the US government is really cracking down on digital currencies. And I don't know if digital currencies will be of much value here in the US come 5 years from now. It depends on how elections go for the midterm elections and some other things, but I think we could face some serious challenges.
I actually think that we've already crossed the chasm, and that so the most recent executive order from Joe Biden on digital currencies, President Biden, is actually very favorable to cryptocurrencies, generally speaking. And it seems to me like so many of the insiders in traditional finance have already jumped ship over to Web3 and crypto, that it's like now at a point where the mainstream has already largely accepted it, even if some of them are a little bit skeptical. It's already I'm highly doubtful that I think basically what the US is realizing is that if it doesn't show thought leadership in this space, that other countries that don't share its general values of like openness and free speech and control over personal finances and personal data, other regimes that don't share those values will start to dictate the rules in this space. And so they want to really show some leadership here. And there will be these things called central bank digital currencies, which will be like
That's sounds so scary.
cryptocurrencies, but where there is some kind of like government approval of and or like blocking of transactions. However, I think there will always be use cases for truly decentralized cryptocurrencies, and so I think that pretty much everyone agrees that this is never totally going away. I mean, I share, I can see why you could be concerned about some things. Um, and just real quick, I wanted to point out one other thing, which is in addition to the Ukraine use case that has been a huge win for crypto, the Canada thing that happened only a few weeks before the invasion of Ukraine was another wake up call for a lot of people, where they saw that the Canadian government was willing to impose really draconian blocking of people who were just trying to support the strikers on those highways, um, who were basically like blocking all of their use of their own bank accounts, just because they wanted to support a certain type of free speech. A lot of people felt that use of the banking control was really, really draconian. And that really scared a lot of people into realizing that there actually is a strong use case for censorship resistance when it comes to our actual cash, our
Well,
savings.
I agree with this 100%, but my problem is that just like with Tor, which is supposedly designed for privacy, I think it's actually designed for spying because it was designed by the military. But um, you know, if you have an entrance node and an exit node, you're caught, right? You are available to the government. As long as you transact within the system, you're fine. But the moment that it hits a Coinbase, all of the privacy or the potential for privacy goes away. And so you're talking about the what?
There's a paper trail.
Yeah, exactly. And so,
well, so I would just say that really we've lived this recognizing it, but if you think about it, we do have cash that we store in our wallets, and once we convert it to cash, like how we use it is pretty opaque. It's not easy for people to find out.
which is why you're not allowed to do a lot of transactions in cash, I recently found out.
Right. My point is that basically the banking system of the US and most every other civilized country already has rules about reporting to the government any transactions that exceed a certain amount.
Or any transaction period.
Yeah, I mean, I think that other types of transactions probably would require a subpoena to obtain, but there is already a standardized way that like banks have to report transactions that I think the threshold is currently like $10,000. But what's also
it's now lowered down to 600.
Okay, yeah, I remember hearing something about that during COVID, but the funny thing about this is that the original rule of 10,000 was in a time when 10,000 was worth about 100,000 of today's dollars. So it's quite interesting that the privacy requirements for amounts of value that you could carry on your person have gotten lower and lower over the last few decades, right? Which is another concern of yours around, government overreach, right? But my point is just that this problem has existed already, and if anything, I would say crypto, especially privacy preserving crypto, at least presents the possibility of doing better than we're currently doing with the existing banking system, right?
Yeah, and I would add to that you don't need to you shouldn't be comparing this to what we have now, because what we have right now is pretty great actually, like with cash. Compare it to where you think we're going, which is central bank digital currency.
Well, actually, I don't think cash is that great, because cash has so many problems. Like you can't carry lots of cash around on you if you really care about your safety and security. And I would say that crypto is much better in the sense that I can transfer it privately in a way that no one sees big wads of cash, bulging out of my pockets, and I can still transfer value across borders, and I can even do it privately if I want to. Yes, it's true that when I eventually convert it to an exchange, I'm going to have to figure something out. But if I wanted to, I could just always just interact with people using crypto and only buy stuff from people who are willing to accept crypto for the things that they give me.
Well, not practically. Theoretically, yes, but not very practically.
Yeah, no, it's not practical at all, but it's just as impractical as walking around with cash. It's just better than that, because with cash...
Because I have to convince, currently, as of today, right now, I have to convince people, right? So first I have to get them on the Coinbase train.
Yeah, okay,
And then
that's-
once they're on the
that's
Coinbase
fair.
train, so it's a lot of
Well, no,
convincing
you don't
and a
have
lot
to
of people
convince anyone to get on the Coinbase train. Just to
I mean, that's kind
Well-
of fair, but like, also, wouldn't you agree that having to, especially for large transactions, having to carry cash with you is also a serious risk?
oh
I
yeah,
d-
I
I
don't know
don't-
if
I
anyone's
don't have to
disagreeing
carry
with you,
cash with me
Carl.
for that.
I mean,
about-
let's also look at civil asset forfeiture, which happens in many states of the union, where actually cops have stopped people just because they had a lot of cash on them and confiscated it for months or even years. I mean, that's so bad, right? Like,
Yeah, no, I think that we all agree that crypto is, well, maybe not. I agree that crypto is much easier to use than cash for many things. The only problem and the big problem is the privacy issue, and
Well,
whether
adoption.
these cryptocurrencies are actually private or not.
yeah,
And adoption. And
yeah, I
yeah,
agree.
so-
Like AJ's point about how most car dealerships aren't going to accept Bitcoin right now. You're going to have to. They
Or
would
even
probably
cash.
Well, I think in a lot of cases they might accept cash, but
If it's a used car.
yeah, I don't know. I haven't tested this theory, but yeah.
Cash is a lot less powerful than I thought it was.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, I mean, actually, most dealerships, if we're talking cars specifically, want you to finance your car. They get a lot of perks for doing that.
yeah,
Yeah, I did
they
not
want it going
realize
through the banking system.
I did not realize how many incentives there. I mean, it's just my eyes have been open. Like I said, between the last time we had this conversation and today, I am in a completely different place than I ever thought I would be.
Mhm.
So I do want to get us kind
We
of.
promised somebody a debate. Somebody needs to have some more. You've gotten soft on us. I need to find somebody else, some other skeptic to.
Well, I'm still raising concerns and questions.
Actually, I feel like this
That's what I wanted to
conversation's
talk
been.
about.
Sorry, I
it's
didn't
been-
mean to jump.
This
up.
has
Go
been
ahead.
really helpful regardless. I mean, there's a lot of topics that I'm interested in discussing, but I think that Carl made a point about, laying a foundation of understanding just the broader, applications of blockchain. And I'm really interested in getting into more specifics with you guys and kind of taking some deep dives, which I think that AJ took us down a couple paths that were really helpful and informative today. Like, for instance, with the DNS, I thought that was actually really interesting to go down that path. But I think that Ryan brought up earlier the idea of what I'm really interested in developing a framework. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs like myself are interested in developing a framework for understanding how to and when to leverage distributed ledger technology, whether you're building an application or whether it's, hey, I'm capitalizing and financing my business, whether it's I'm trying to do a unique structure and I'm considering using a DAO. I mean, I think that there's a lot of I think that I'm outnumbered in terms of just you guys are much more into the technical side of this, but I kind of represent this base of investors and entrepreneurs who are, most of us deal in tech, and so we're more technical than your typical citizen. But I would love to have a follow-up conversation and dig into some applications that I've kind of listed out and as potential use cases, and that framework is what I'm interested in developing, and when blockchain makes a ton of sense, and when it's like, yeah, you could use blockchain if you subscribe to a philosophy of decentralization.
Yeah, like what's the pitch? What's the infrastructure pitch? Basically, is the question, and I think Carl would
I have
do
to
a good
interrupt.
job of that.
I have to interrupt. I missed that last little bit. I have 10 minutes left on this. So keep on going. Just know hard stop 10 minutes.
I just wanted to, I think, Matt, your question's a good one, and it's a little harder to answer. I also just wanted to add, I was going to mention earlier after AJ spoke that I actually feel like this discussion today has seemed more productive to me. I I don't know why, what the difference was that made it seem like we gained further ground. But anyway, I thought it was pretty good.
Agreed.
So um, I would say in terms of where Web3 can really be helpful, um, one of the challenges is that many of these infrastructure pieces that I mentioned, like the storage layer, the database layer, the compute layer, all of those things need to be pretty mature before you can reliably build a decent decentralized application or DApp. Um, and right now, what we see mostly is most of the dApps that are being built are relying on like Arweave or um, IPFS or Swarm, which are some. SIA is another one. Some storage layers, decentralized storage layers, um, to just store like raw web assets, like things like HTML, JavaScript, images. So you can store your web app on decentralized storage. You can use an ENS domain to point to that decentralized location so that anyone who wants to can at least download the static assets that your web app needs to function. And then you can define in the HTML and JavaScript how it communicates with a blockchain. So apps that
Yeah.
do this level of decentralization are already widespread and they're all over the place. Most of them, I would say, are DeFi apps, meaning that they're like trying to provide some kind of a decentralized financial service. Um, and that's already useful, but for me, that only scratches the surface of all the things you could do. Like where I would love to see more innovation would be in social media, like to see a decentralized version of Facebook, for example, or Twitter that was owned by the community, where each participant in this platform is paying small little microtransactions for the amount of data that they're retrieving and storing and all that kind of stuff. And maybe there's some incentivization to make sure that people are only posting messages that are really helpful and beneficial and not just trash talking the whole time. But think of how you could incentivize behavior in
Oh,
these
Carl,
networks.
where would I go?
I mean, that's the thing, is that what's right now, what we have is we've got these social media platforms, but a lot of value capture is happening in these large companies that are sort of utilizing you as the product. They say if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, right? And so we're seeing how discourse can get manipulated when there are like ulterior financial motives in the whole process, right? And so it would be really cool to see social media become more community governed. That wouldn't prevent some crazy stuff from being on social media. There might be like a small hornet's nest of Nazis that actually wants to like run their own community. But I would say for the most part, I feel like you would start to see the emergence of large democratic communities that are managing the kind of content that they want on their platforms and the kind they don't, and that are like agreeing to abide by widely shared standards, where it's like you could get truly I don't know, you just have like a Twitter but with less concern about the way the particular people in charge at Twitter are deciding to govern the network and police certain
Censor things.
behaviors. Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
I have to mention then. I personally think that the BSV community, Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision community, is leading the way on this. They've already got an application like what you're talking about, decentralized Twitter. It's called Twetch, and that's not the only thing they have. They have a ton of these apps that are basically decentralized social apps, social media, social decentralized Twitter, but also gaming. And I've been following
So
a lot of work from that community. The only problem, I have to put in this caveat real quick too, though, as well, they are on the extreme end of saying we don't even
right.
need a block size limit at all. And
So
so what happens is tons of data is being stored, weather data, all sorts of data is being stored on that blockchain. And it is actually causing, in my opinion, the exact problem that some of the BTC Bitcoiners were trying to point out with the blockchain is enormous, and it does cost a ton of money to run one of those nodes. And so there consequently aren't that many of those nodes. And that community would have, some rebuttals to that, what I just said. But I think the point stands that it's just trade-offs.
And
Yeah.
and with an unlimited block size, if you did that, even if all the only transactions were allowed were monetary, you could just pick the smallest unit, exchange that back and forth, and you could basically just have the keys be throwaway, and you could use that as an arbitrary data storage mechanism. You could store a gigabyte of data in public keys that don't actually connect to anything, I guess. So, there's no technology that's sufficiently advanced that someone can't sufficiently abuse it.
I also have to just mention that the prominent backer of BSV is Craig Wright, who is very, very controversial in the blockchain space generally. And a lot of people,
because he claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto? What do you mean?
yeah, exactly.
He does.
So
yeah.
a lot of people have steered clear of that blockchain for that and other reasons. I mean, he's made a lot of spurious charges and hasn't been able to provide evidence for them. So I've also met BSV folks who insist that their blockchain is infinitely scalable with a straight face. And it just strikes me that at least some of them, the ones I've met, don't seem to have a really strong understanding of computer science. And so
Well,
I don't want to hastily generalize the whole community though, but anyway.
Right. And I was skeptical of that community as well, but I have discovered that there are quite a few really good, really smart people in that community as well.
Cool.
Isaac Morehouse is one of them. He has a series of interviews on the topic of microtransactions. So if you are interested in that kind of thing, look at Isaac Morehouse's YouTube. Okay. There's just some really cool user experiences that are being developed on that blockchain. Personally, I don't think it's sustainable, but it's working right now.
So yeah. I'm up against my time, and I still want to end with the question that I started. Are there any real world? Well, we've got one, domains. I saw that work. I saw it work. Do we? Well, I guess could we just go back to the weather and the GPS?
Yeah.
Is that
that's
actually?
Why I brought this up, AJ. That's why I brought this up. You got to look to the BSV community for the things that you're looking for.
I will.
They have
really,
applications.
really quickly.
They have games actually running on blockchains right now.
But are they more efficient or better in some way?
Okay, I'm just going to show you guys really fast since you asked.
Sure.
Oh.
This is the Foam network. FOAM.space is the URL.
Okay.
And what they've done, remember how I showed you networks that were incentivized with the IOU system?
Yes.
They've created a network where you have beacons that are using LoRa radio. I don't know if you've heard of LoRa.
Is that IoT wave?
It's like a sort of frequency of radio that allows for metropolitan level scale in radio, where like you've got a range of several miles between devices, but it's lower bandwidth, right?
Yeah, we need some.
So just really quick, I'll just summarize this. So what they're doing is they're creating a network of beacons whose actual coordinates on the globe are known and precisely pinpointed. And then those beacons can be used by anyone that has the client, the radio client, to triangulate their position. And the reason why this is useful, and each beacon operator is incentivized to provide that service through tokens, right? But the reason why this is really interesting and useful is that right now, our global positioning system depends on satellites that are always one of the prime targets for any nation state during a war, right? And we are so reliant on GPS data now for all shipping and all logistics and many other use cases besides Uber and all sorts of other things, that if our GPS system were to be downgraded or go offline for various reasons, it would cause billions or even trillions of dollars in damages. And so this is an example of a decentralized network that provides the same kind of service that's emerging and that's powered and incentivized by blockchain.
So explain that, powered by and incentivized by. So incentivized by IOU system.
That's right. Yeah, like
okay?
There's an actual cryptocurrency that is paid to node operators.
Okay, so how is it powered by? The data is stored on a blockchain?
It's incentivized by.
You could argue that without that incentivization layer, that IOU layer that we're talking about, you basically would no longer have a network because nobody would bother, running their nodes just for the hell of it. They would want to get compensated in some way.
Well, yeah, but this is run by individuals or run by companies, or how is that?
Any number of individuals or companies, any entity, any person, or any wallet holder can offer this service. They don't even need to necessarily identify their private details.
And so why do people join? Is it because they're blockchain enthusiasts, or is it because it solves some sort of problem for them?
Well, I would say a lot of them are just true believers in the eventual utility of this network, right at this moment. But I think that over the longer term, you're going to start to see, some significant benefits from running one. I mean, once you set it up, it takes a minor amount of electricity and you just keep earning money while it's in service, right? There's also an incentive, a first mover advantage. There's kind of like asymptotic reward rates, so that like someone who gets into the network earlier and provides beacon services earlier is going to earn more tokens than someone who gets in later.
That's called a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, I was going to say.
No, it's not.
It's called a stock. Actually, it's called a security.
It's called an early, first mover, early adopter advantage.
It's called a security that the normal Joe can have access to, rather than accredited investors, and it's a great thing, I think.
Yeah, it's like this kind of incentivization models
even if it's illegal.
These incentivization models are used to bootstrap networks because they create an incentive to get in quick. Now, what we're starting to learn in the DeFi space is that a lot of times people will what's called ape into it, but then they will bail really fast after a few weeks.
Is it called ape into it after the yacht apes?
Yeah, basically. I think that's where it came from. Is the
no, it's
the Bored
more
Apes, right? Like, I mean, maybe it came before that, but like the term
it's the
is
human
kind of
natural instinct to just jump into something.
That's right.
Thinking through it.
It's sort of like coming from our primitive ancestors, and the idea that you're like behaving like a
irrationally.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I want to acknowledge a few comments. There's been a bunch while we've been talking, and some of them are no longer relevant, but just possibly some ideas for next time. The handshake protocol, that sounds like something new. I think I may have heard of that once. Talking about offline wallets, and then there's just this general idea of, are we actually talking about blockchains, or are we just talking about run-of-the-mill peer-to-peer technology? And I think, Carl, you answered that to some effect, in that the blockchain part in a lot of these things is the IOU system. It's the proof of service, saying because you are participating in a valuable way, other people are willing to give to you as well. And I do have some questions I'd like. I mean, the big thing on that is, well, what if my usage is asymmetric? I am a participant in the network. I'm available when other people need me, but I do 80% of the sins, because in all systems, 20% of the inputs create 80% of the outputs. And so how does something like that work out in one of these systems? I'd be curious about, but I don't want to go into that now, because I'm done. I'm out.
Yeah.
And then, all goods and value, just, I guess, this comment here from Geek Hunger, with all goods that have value and can be exchanged, you need a place where everyone comes to trade them, and that place is centralized always. That I think is a good point. But I also,
Well, actually, I would say no. Just real quick, a DEX, for example, a decentralized exchange, is provided on a censorship-resistant storage layer, and it uses blockchain protocols, which are also decentralized across several validator nodes to enable people to exchange, to purchase and sell tokens. But none of the things they go through in order to do that are single points of failure or single computers or gateways. So in that sense, it is a decentralized process, and it's possible to have a gathering place like a DEX that is still, for all intents and purposes, mostly decentralized.
so is DEX a real thing, or are you just using that as
No, that's a real thing. There's a ton
how
of
do I
DeFi
get to
projects
DEX?
that are DEXs.
DEX is decentralized exchange.
So
is-
any
do I-
decentralized exchange. So how about
But what is one?
Uniswap? Let's just use a really, really popular one. So if you go to
And then one that's broader than Uniswap is Thorchain as well. They do cross chain exchanges, not just within the Ethereum ecosystem.
So if you go to uniswap.org, you could then click on launch app, and then you're using a DEX. That's just one example. That's a really popular one. So
This is just trading one token or one
several tokens,
on that
right?
One
Yeah.
for another.
Yeah.
So
I think
question.
what the commenter was more talking about was goods and services, though, right? You
So-
could, though, create something like that. That's like a decentralized eBay or.
It looks like Dash is not on there, unfortunately. But here's my question. Is there a record kept with these? So could I be transacting in one digital currency, go to a DEX, move that to a different digital currency,
Yep.
and then not have it say, well, this came from that?
So no, you still that transaction would still be traceable, and there are a lot of analytics services that are emerging that help trace in intimate detail what's going on. Like,
Yeah, but what if
when
I want
swaps occur.
what if I want privacy?
No, there are some that are targeting privacy, though.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I would
sure
say
how
just generally
popular they are
speaking,
yet.
that's not happening very much. It's still very traceable. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but there's,
I
not
just
as much.
I this is what I want.
It's coming, AJ. It's coming.
Come here, sweetie.
Hey guys, I gotta head out. This has been a lot of fun. I just posted a comment with some follow-up topics I might be interested in discussing another time. But this has been really informative. Carl and Ryan, really appreciate you guys taking the time.
Sure.
And AJ, thanks for making this happen. This has been a blast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nice meeting you,
Yeah.
Matt.
Hi, Addie. Good to see you. I'm sure she doesn't recognize me. But...
She can't hear you. You can say hello.
Hi. How are you?
All right. Well, I gotta go. I'm on
Okay.
kids duty. I'm overdue. Thanks for joining in. For those of you that commented, I'm sorry for those of you that I didn't address your comments in time and that the discussion went in a different way. But I really do appreciate that you did drop some comments. Again, like, follow, sub if you found this to be interesting or useful. Please comment on. I guess YouTube would be the best place to comment. Comment with additional follow-ups that you'd like to see us go into, because I'd like to have another discussion. Is everybody amenable to having another discussion?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, and maybe we could bring on another expert in a particular topic and kick off Matt. Actually, Matt wants to be around when we discuss DAOs. So I think maybe the next one we should discuss DAOs.
I'm
that's a
happy for
great
you guys
idea.
to pick me off. I just posted some stuff that I'm hoping to talk to Ryan and or Carl about at some point. But
Yeah,
I don't
that'd
know
be
if it's even interesting to AJ's broader community. I think that AJ's community is probably a little more technical and interested in. So this is more stuff related to startups and investment funds and just innovation, the innovation ecosystem and how things work. So
Great. Yeah. No, that'd be fun.
Okay,
Like-
thanks, guys.
I think that kind of stuff would be interesting too. I'd love to. I think the next one, I'd love to discuss DAOs and some of that startup stuff, and then go back around to some more protocol stuff.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Anyway,
Bye.
I'll go ahead and send us off here. Let's see if I've got any good Mimi things to put up here.
The
Oh, that one
Dogecoin
didn't.
ding thing.
I
that you do.
I did the ding, but I don't have the Dogecoin on this scene in
Oh.
OBS, so it didn't work. All right. Anyway, again, thank you everybody. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Like, sub, follow if you want to, and we're out. Adios.
Okay. Talk to you guys later.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.